Good evening, and welcome to a conversation with Leela Fernandes. I am Jeff Riedinger, Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of Washington. I'm pleased to be here tonight as part of UW Global Month. Throughout November, we celebrate our university's global impact and community. I hope you will join us for other inspiring events later this month. The UW educates more than 50,000 students annually, and the Husky community is connected around the world. Thanks to our incredible faculty and researchers, we have partnerships and projects in more than 130 countries, yielding a world of opportunity for students, including rich study abroad experiences and unique programs like the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies Task Force Initiative. As one of the oldest and largest schools of its kind, the Jackson School has long been a leader in international and area studies education, boasting 21 centers and programs. I'm delighted to introduce our featured guest, the new director of the Jackson School, and Stanley D. Golub Chair of International Studies, Dr. Leela Fernandes. Leela is an internationally recognized scholar and author of democratic politics and inequality with a focus on contemporary India. A professor of gender studies and political science with a STEM background, Dr. Fernandes received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. She is currently working on a new research project, Governing Water in India, Urbanization, Inequality, and the Liberalizing State. This research analyzes changes in the state and the emergence of new forms of inequality through a study of the water sector in contemporary India. She previously taught at the University of Michigan, as well as at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and Oberlin College. Next, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Akhtar Badshah. Akhtar is an expert on social impact, philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, and international development. Currently, he serves as the chair of the board of directors of Global Washington. He is the founder and chief catalyst of Catalytic Innovators Group. He teaches at the University of Washington Evans School for Public Policy and Governance and at the UW Bothell Business School. He also serves as the faculty advisor for the Strategic Analysis, Research, and Training Center at the Department of Global Health. His new book, The Purpose Mindset: How Microsoft Inspires Its Employees and Alumni to Change the World, is well worth reading. Thank you both for being here, and I look forward to listening to what promises to be an informative and inspiring discussion. Take it away, Akhtar.
Jeff, thank you so much, and giving us the opportunity to share our thoughts on this very important occasion. I'm actually thrilled that we have this global month at the University of Washington. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Fernandes to Seattle and to the University of Washington. It's going to be a great time that you will have with us, but we are going to benefit so much from the richness of the work that you have done. Leela, let me just start off by having you reflect a little bit on what has just happened over the last couple of weeks and our election. And from your perspective, what does this mean for foreign policy and development issues, given where the election is and where the results are, and the still churn that is happening?
First of all, thank you for that warm welcome. I'm really happy to be here and speaking with you, getting a chance to talk to you in particular. And thank you for that great question. We are in kind of interesting times. We don't really quite know how global events are going to unfold in relationship to the election. At one level, Biden's clear victory is probably reassuring to U.S. traditional allies, and there's probably some sense of hope that there'll be at least stability in terms of leadership and how the U.S. government generally functions. But there's still a fair amount of domestic turmoil, which is going to happen, which is going to continue regardless of what how the next few weeks in the transition unfold. And that domestic turmoil, has national security implications. And I think even aside from that, in the past 4 years, so much has changed that it's not going to be a situation where Joe Biden's election can take us back to a normal, back to normal. It's not that we can't sort of go back 4 years and turn back the clock. And so Biden is going to face many, many more challenges because there've been so many geopolitical shifts. He's going to have to think in a more forward-looking way because a lot has changed with changes in U.S. foreign policies from the past 4 years. I think specifically in terms of development, I think the U.S. has a big challenge because the protectionist mindset has really changed how the U.S. as a government thinks about development. Trump did not begin a protectionist feeling. There's always been sort of a pushback against things like international aid and development assistance, but that has intensified, I think, over the last 4 years. And that is coinciding with a time when China is being very aggressive, with things like or assertive with things like the Road and Belt Initiative. And so development itself is an interesting foreign policy issue, which marks some of these changes, which we don't really know how are playing out. I think that we're not, basically the short answer is there's no normal to return to, and we're going to have to see how the US sort of grapples with a changing world.
And I'm quite sure that there is, even for other aspects, there is not going to be the new normal in any case.
Yeah.
But let me just kind of focus on our students, and especially the international students. What should they take from this election? Should they be reassured?
It's a difficult question. At one level, there is a hope that some of the very punitive, to be blunt, restrictions on visas, could be quickly overturned. Just the pressures that have been put on higher education with some of the, past Trump administration restrictions on student visas and some of the proposed restrictions, which would have hit universities very hard in terms of the length of student visas. So it's possible that there could be some just immediate relief if that, because those things can be overturned fairly quickly through executive policy. And so there should be some reassurance with that. Also with things like, the infamous Muslim ban, those kinds of things, if they're overturned quickly, will send a message of some reassurance. In terms, but there are still other kinds of issues. We have populations of undocumented work people, students who are very insecure. The Dreamers Act could help some portions, but it's probably not enough. And so I think that I think there is some reassurance, but I think that there's still a climate of in terms of domestic conflict over race and ethnicity, which also has challenges for international students.
Let me thank you very much for that. And I think that just as a emphasis to what Leela has just said, we want to make sure from an institution perspective that we make our international students comfortable. Mm-hmm. And global affairs and global issues is now, even if it was not prominent before, it is completely prominent. Simply because of what happened in March, or what started happening in January and has continued because of COVID and the pandemic, and the way it has impacted all of our lives, including higher education. And things are not likely to return to pre-COVID environment anyways, at least not in the near future. So from your perspective, what is the role of higher education in solving complex global issues, especially the role of international education?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a large question. I could only probably take a small bite into it because it is so complex. You know, there's so much one could say, but I think I would start by just focusing on questions of inequality, because I think what COVID has done is it has really highlighted um, things that many people have known for a long time, but it has maybe made it more visible to more privileged people, just the intensity of racial and socioeconomic inequality within the United States, as well as inequalities between countries, particularly in terms of poverty in the global South, and that you see that in terms of access to healthcare. You see that in terms of disparities of which populations are being hit by COVID, in disproportionate ways. And we'll likely see that when we have a vaccine, hopefully if we have a vaccine, in terms of how distribution will occur, and will it occur in ways that are inclusive both within the United States and then across the globe, or will richer countries sort of buy up or monopolize some of the resources, as did happen in some periods when some of the drugs were in shortage. So higher education has to think more seriously about inequality and access. And even with international students are not all equal. And we need to think about, how we are opening the doors more to students who maybe don't have as much privilege, particularly as the economic effects of COVID will make the job market so much tighter. And so we're going to have, I think there's going to be pressures on higher education, unlike before, at least in terms of the recent past, to confront questions of inequality, inclusion, discrimination, because of just the intensity of long-standing structural inequalities which have existed for a long time, and the pressures that COVID has put on them. And then the flip side of it, maybe the more positive side of higher education, would be making basically, COVID also teaches us how global connections are that you cannot escape them. You cannot put up a wall to stop the virus. We are so interconnected. Through global supply chains, through travel, through transnational processes, we cannot really live in a context where we think we can get away with not knowing about the world. And that's an opportunity for higher education in terms of thinking about international education.
And so just, since you touched on to the issues of inequities, and I'm going to come back to COVID again, but I wanted to just kind of get one thought from you about the inequities, which you rightly highlighted, the global inequities that are there. How do we prepare our students to think critically about it, both at the Jackson School and then campus-wide, right? I mean, how do we get our students to think about these issues of inequities and global inequities in particular?
That's a great question. So I'll probably just be able to touch the surface. But for one thing, let's just take a global perspective for a second. For one thing, to really understand inequality, you really have to understand it within context, within historical context, within cultural context, because the nature of inequality varies depending on which country or which, even frankly, region or locality within a country you're talking about. And so sometimes we think of inequality, and it's very easy, or it's not easy, but there's a tendency sometimes in particular models of multiculturalism to just come up with a list of identities or inequalities. And the list doesn't really do justice to the complexities of how inequalities are borne out, how they intersect, when some inequalities are overdetermined, when they're more complicated. And understanding those kinds of intersections is particularly critical, because without that understanding, you might have a policy solution which seeks to address one set of inequalities, but produces new forms of exclusion.
Yes.
So understanding those contradictions and not being and not kind of assuming an easy checklist where you kind of think the main inequalities is one challenge. And then the second, the possibility is also to think about how can people in different countries who know so much about their own societies, inequalities within their own societies, teach each other so that it's a more of a mutual form of engagement, global engagement. So the global engagement is not just kind of a savior model of saving other people, but of really learning mutually across cultures and borders.
No, great. This is so talking about education, and now that we are in this virtual world, how are you thinking of cross-border and cross-cultural connections and collaborations, given that we're still going to be online, at least, I mean, winter we are online, we're probably going to be online in spring. How do we get that cross-border collaboration to take place if we are not going to be able to move people around?
So that has both possibilities and also challenges. So the possibilities are that with technology, you can have, virtual engagements in some ways without travel. So that can open up possibilities. And those possibilities can make it more reciprocal, because the classic study abroad model, for example, in the US, is about US students going to other countries and learning, just learning through experience. We could think of more collaborative ways of sort of engaging different sets of audiences across borders. But it also poses challenges because not everybody has access to internet, obviously, yes. So, the large sections of student populations will be left out. So, for example, I'm originally from India. Even elite public institutions, like one of the elite public institutions would be JNU in Delhi. Large populations of the students are not able to get stable internet access because many of them are from rural areas or from small towns. And so online education is really not possible in the way that we might assume. So, so that also makes us think about, what, even in terms of the usual divides of elites and non-elites, really will vary based on national, inequalities between nations. And so that will, that's why, I started by saying the biggest challenge will be thinking about inequality. And then the second issue, which is a more complicated one, is some of the issues around security for students from in countries which are more state-controlled, or border and authoritarian states. There are threats in terms, or just risks in terms of freedom of speech or freedom of inquiry within, even in the context of Zoom technology. And so, so that also constrains the ability to speak across borders freely. So a lot of our challenges about freedom of inquiry, freedom of discussion, access to education are really, they're also highlighted by the virtual world. The virtual world is not, technology is not a magical solution that provides necessarily inclusion in the way we sometimes think it is. It's still marked by some of those materials, long-standing historical structures that have preceded these new ways of communicating.
And by the way, this is not an issue just at JNU. It's also an issue here at UW. I taught my class last term in spring at Bothell with an undergraduate student body. And Bothell is, a lot of these students are first generation students coming from diverse backgrounds. And the majority, 70 to 80% of my students for the whole term never turned on their video.
Yeah.
Because they just didn't have adequate bandwidth to be able to do that. Or they did not want, they were multitasking with family, and because now kids were at home, other things were at home, they didn't have a separate room to study. So they were on mute and the video was off.
Yeah.
The same time I was teaching an honors class for undergrads, and every single student had their video on, and every single student had a separate place by study. So we have this divide in this country also. So for educators, we need to be a little bit more cognizant of how we are thinking about our course structures and how to do collaboration. And I think that's going to be very important. And I think one point that you highlighted, especially for our students, right now we have so many students who are in different parts of the world taking our classes.
Yeah.
And many of them are behind certain walls, the technology walls. And for us to be able to recognize what they can write and not write in terms of papers, etc., is actually very important. So I think you raised some very important points for us. Just moving forward, what is the role of international education, Leela, and especially through the University of Washington, that we can assist and aid in solving some of these complex global issues that we are facing today?
It's a difficult question. I think, let me answer it in a way, in a different kind of way, just rather than give kind of a rehearsed answer.
Yeah.
I think we need to start with a bit of humility.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, too often, so there's a myth about university. Let me just give you a kind of a blunter answer. There's a myth about universities being ivory towers. That's not. It's real. I've never really bought that myth between the ivory tower and the population, because universities in the academy in the United States has had a huge impact in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy. And I think some of the activist critiques that the academy is just an ivory tower has always missed that. And part of that impact has been really developing policy solutions, which have a particular kind of, what's the word? There's a kind of production process of policy in terms of, you sort of, how can I explain this in easy ways, in clear ways, where you identify a global problem and you want kind of a solution which is based on data. Obviously, you need the data, but a lot of the time the drive is to get something modular, something clean, something simple, which you can implement at a wide scale a lot of the time. And then in reaction to that, you've had a lot of grassroots models which have proliferated, and there's been sometimes a gap between the global policy model and the grassroots model. And I think what we let's just take something like climate change, for example. A lot of times the global climate change policies, which are coming out from for lack of a better word, from like European or American or Western contexts, they are good in theory, but they don't work in practice. And the only way we're going to have climate change work in practice is if we have students who are, let's just say the University of Washington or in the United States, who know exactly how things work on the ground in other countries. To know the histories, to know, for example, how local bureaucratic structures work, how local models of governance work, because a model might be really, really appealing, and we might think we have a solution, but if you put it in a context and, you have, you have local bureaucrats, and they will just, if it's tied to funding, for example, they'll check all the boxes to get the funding, but it'll never be implemented the way that you want it. And too often you see that kind of translation in which really good policy ideas fail because they have this kind of top to down flow. And so the challenge would be really to embed a level of humility in terms of how we think of international education, which also, we still have deep histories of colonialism, which shape how we think about studying the world. We still think of the world as out there, and we sort of study it and we know answers. And there needs to be a deeper epistemological shift, which changes how we think about that. So we need to learn first before we can solve these problems.
No, thank you very much. And I completely agree, right? That, that there is there are these two sides to academia. One, clearly academia is engaged and active and can help and shift policies on the ground because we have faculty that are engaged, they know their stuff, they're deeply connected and, work with, on the ground realities. And then you kind of have this other side, which actually just assumes everything that works within one context can be applied to another context, and miss out on what I actually call tasting the ground, where you are really willing to go walk in a slum and get on your knees, taste that ground. And the thing that might happen to you is you're going to go fall sick. And when you fall sick, then you will actually discover the effectiveness of the healthcare system. And then you can actually talk about, how you think about healthcare in a country otherwise you're just being theoretical in nature. So I really appreciate how you kind of, even for our students to kind of understand that if you're going to start looking at cross-cultural issues, spend some time understanding that and not coloring from your own experience, which is also true, but at least trying to look at it from a different perspective and a different lens. So one question, now that you are here and you have got a sense of the Jackson School, the University of Washington, you're also seeing the global shifts and challenges that are taking place. How has that informed your vision for the school?
Let me just link it back to what you were saying before, because I love the way you talked about the tasting the ground metaphor. And this it'll connect in a roundabout way to your question. So just bear with me a little bit. So, right now in the world which we live, which is so driven by all these new technologies, it's natural that we have such an focus on big data. That's the new thing, which higher education is really focused on big data, and we have to be. We have to study it, we have to understand it, we have to use it. It's needed, but the danger in that is that we have such a we end up with a narrow we risk ending up with an understanding of data which is so narrow that it reproduces some of the older positivistic ideas of data in terms of just empirical or sort of big quantitative data. And I've spent most of my career trying to push I'm trained officially as a political scientist, to trying to get social scientists to understand the importance of basically on-the-ground ethnography, kind of the qualitative work which you were talking about, and to understand that is actually data, that this is not just kind of random observations or anecdotes, that spending, for example, a year and a half, say, studying an industry, you learn things which are factual and empirical, which you may not get through other forms of quantitative or sort of policy analysis. And I think that connects to what you were saying. And so in terms of training students, there's also a danger of assuming that you can learn about other countries simply by amassing lots of data, because you don't actually have to leave your laptop to get masses of data about other countries. And my entire career has been built on saying that you won't really learn anything if you just stay with that. You have to go, and you have to go on the ground. And I think, to link this back to your question about the Jackson School, the reason, people sometimes think that it's strange that I moved across the country in the middle of a pandemic, but the Jackson School is really precious because I think of any other international studies school in the country, and I feel confident making that because I just did a survey of qualitative survey of all the APSIA schools. The Jackson School is really unique in the way in which it values and centers qualitative, in-depth, interpretive, field-based research, which takes context, including historical, cultural, linguistic context seriously, and connects that to bigger international themes. And you can see that in the richness of the faculty and the classes they teach. And I think those are the kinds of things which we will continue to build on. And I think what I want to do personally is to find ways to continue to show people, in terms of public engagement, why they need to learn from that kind of, metaphor of tasting the ground, why we cannot find the solutions that we need without that lens being included. Not that it's the only lens, but that without that lens, you fall short. And for me, that's the treasure of the Jackson School, that it is unique in that way.
So, we might be able to ask questions from from our attendees. But before I get to that, because people are already typing some stuff
Yeah, I noticed that.
in
Yeah.
there, but I wanted to kind of ask you, we know we have, obviously Jeff is on here, Anand Yang is here, Frank Conlon is here. You've got these major institutional leaders here. If you had one ask of what you would like so that the student body could succeed in becoming much better prepared during this extraordinary times that we are in, what would that be? And I know
Yeah.
I'm putting you on the spot here.
So I'm laughing because I'm tempted to say money after all the
No,
complexity.
but that's okay. So money, right? So now what with money?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm kind of playing around in my head. These are just ideas and conversations with colleagues. I would love to see a digital dimension to higher education, which can be more democratic because it can allow for participation. Like this forum, I'm looking at the chat and people are saying hello from Turkey and from other countries, and
Yeah.
to find a way to manifest that, to have a more democratic dimension, where the Jackson School is international, not just in terms of what it teaches, but actually have an international component linked in live ways as part of the curriculum. So kind of like, how a version of how, if I'm dreaming, since you're asking me to dream, if there's like infinite money, a lot of universities have set up satellite campuses in different countries. I would love to have a digital version of that for the Jackson School. Like have a little sort of satellite, not a physical campus, but a virtual space where looking again at all the alumni who are chatting, to have them, and to have students in other universities, be in other countries, to be part of a campus, a virtual campus linked to the Jackson School, and to have the funding for that, and to really grapple with these issues of inequality by listening to people, for our students at the University of Washington, to learn from students and what they're grappling with, because even when we talk about categories of elite and non-elite, there's things which we still take for granted in urban areas in the United States. It's just basic infrastructural things, which even middle-class people in some of the wealthier global South countries, they just don't have access to. And there could be a lot of mutual learning, I think, from that kind of a setup. So if I had money, that's what I would do, and I would have it properly staffed.
But I think that's a very fascinating idea, though.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And when you really look at it from the perspective of how do we create digital hubs? And and again, I might throw it back to some of the alumni who are from different parts of the world that have joined, right? What resources would it really take to even start off with one digital hub, right? Which is it's really now just an arrangement with the faculty and an alumni, and then saying, are there opportunities that you can actually provide to even start initial exchange, virtual exchange with students on both sides, right? And how could that be possible? And I think that, yes, staffing and all might become eventually the way to go, but it might be an interesting idea to just start with a conversation with colleagues that all of us know that are situated around the world. And I think everybody is kind of looking at new opportunities.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and it's something it's just in my head right now. But I'm hoping to actually try to start something more small scale. But I think, I think those conversations are happening, but they happen at an individual level. And what would it be like to have it more systematic, like a structured curriculum, so that people were having systematic access, so that students in other countries had access also to, it's reciprocal. Our students would learn so much, and students from other countries would also have access to resources that we have as well. So yeah, so if anyone, all the people who are in the chat room, if you're interested, let us know.
I want to just share a little bit about, some of the work that I've been working on, especially with my new book, Purpose Mindset. And one of the things that, I've been very fascinated about because of the work that I do in the philanthropic community and in the social impact space is how do we think about equipping individuals and students to go beyond the growth mindset, right? Which is Carol Dweck's seminal work on how do we actually, from Stanford University, how we think about growth mindset and be this continuous learner, improve, question, and grow ourselves beyond what might just be given to us. To where I look at in terms of developing purpose, where purpose is extending the individual good for the common good. So we are kind of moving from the me to the we. And how do we think about student experiences that get students to not just focus on immediate success? And I think that it is important, right? Where you want to be successful, you want to grow, but then also get them to develop this purpose mindset that encourages them to again think in this global manner where we actually start creating more connections than less. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I love the way you frame that, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. It sounds really wonderful. I've thought a lot about this because I did the thing which you're not supposed to do. I left a financially lucrative field. I was trained as a computer engineer just when the field was, and I went a completely different route in my career, and I wouldn't do anything different. So I would say two things. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but there's a lot of new, very complicated and insightful research from the discipline of economics, where people are showing how perceptions on choice in higher education are much more complicated than simply students wanting success, that in fact institutions are shaping students' perceptions, and sometimes students' choices in majors, for example, really depends on the messaging they're sent, or the kind of what's the word? The context in which they're placed. And so the assumption that we sometimes have as academics, not all of us, some of us, is that students want to get a good paying job, and obviously their parents want that, and so they will go into the professional schools, or they will go into disciplines which they think will be lucrative. But some of this, and this is done by really well-known economists, is really showing how that's actually not true. That if you really do, and they do a lot of experimental work, and they show that students actually are much more complicated in how they make decisions. And so this is, this loops back to what you had initially started with, is that what are we doing in higher education in terms of the messaging that we are sending? So if we're sending a message that, that certain fields are elevated, or certain fields are sort of like the soft fields, we're setting norms for students, and students are responding to cues, and those cues are shaping their perceptions. So there's one level at which I think, this is where higher education can have a big impact. So let us think about, for example, what we're telling students about the value of, say, liberal arts education, which may not be utilitarian, or different disciplines within a utilitarian, within a liberal arts education. Students who want to maybe learn a language which is unfamiliar, would be, could set them on a path of complete success and purpose. So purpose and success don't have to be in opposition.
Absolutely not. Yeah,
but
I completely agree with you.
Yeah, we assume that there's a kind of direct proportion between students' needs and desires and then the market. And we assume that's a natural connection. And I think that it's not. I think that those connections are shaped, and all of us play a role in shaping that. And so and and um, and I think we have to interrogate ourselves. I think those of us who are like people like me who are tenured in universities, how do we find ways to show students or model to students different paths, different futures, to kind of embody what we want them to do, to think about purpose-driven lives, to show them that it matters to think about people who are less privileged than you, and it matters, not just because you're saving them, but it matters for your own sense of growth as well. So I don't know if that's
Yeah.
a complete answer, but
No,
those are,
I think, in my book, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, who I interviewed, had that exact same quote, that you are actually not doing it to save somebody. You're actually doing it because it makes you better,
yeah,
and that it is self-driven
Yeah.
more than anything else. So in some ways, all of these are in some ways selfish exercises that leads to selflessness.
yes,
And I think that's the important kind of education we need to provide our students as to how they, through self-growth and self-improvement, they're actually making other people and other people's lives better. So thank you very much for sharing. I know we have some time to take questions and people are filling up the chat here. So let me see if I can actually go and ask a few questions that are here and then maybe come back again to end. So Wendy Freitag is saying, do you see unique opportunities that can now be realized that we have a president-elect first lady with an extensive higher education background?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. So much happens that I don't even think I've had the time for that to sink in yet. So I think, it's a little bit like when Obama was elected. I think having someone in that position matters a lot because it does shift people's perceptions, and it has a real impact on the younger generations, for particularly in the United States, which has been very, very, the United States has really lagged behind the world in terms of women at the presidential prime minister level, in terms of elections. If you compare it even to South Asia or Europe, United States has taken a long time, and at least we've gotten to the vice presidency. And so that makes a big difference. But I think it'll also matter what she does. I think it's clear from the messages that Biden is sending that she's not going to simply be she's going to have a substantive role with him. She's going to be engaged, and she's an incredibly, I don't know if anyone has watched her in the Senate judiciary hearings, I believe it is. She's incredibly tough. She's been one of the best questionnaires of all of those committee members in many ways. So just watching her and what she does is going to be interesting. But I think, in terms of the substantive issues, there are people who are really going to want to see substantive work on racial inequality, on gender inequality. So representation at that level is very critical, but it has to come with the substantive policy changes. And, and I'm hopeful that it will, but, both, I think that there's a tall order of problems that the president and vice president-elect are going to be facing. So we'll see.
Yeah, but I think that and absolutely, we are thrilled. I mean, people of color, Indian American origin, women, there are just these so many different elements that have got touched upon. But I think the question was also looking at the president-elect first lady, Biden's wife, and her higher education experience. What would that mean?
Yes.
And I kind of want this to be looked at it from caution, where we had Hillary Clinton assuming a very substantive role in, Bill Clinton's presidency, with her focus on healthcare, which kind of did have a setback in some ways
Yeah.
till Obama came into power. So I just want your kind of reflections as to the role of first ladies in moving substantive agendas.
That's a really great question. Yeah, and I missed the first lady part of the question, I think. It's interesting because one of Biden's speeches since he won, he said, he made a comment about the fact that you'll have higher education represented in the White House. Is what he said that. So it was an interesting fact that he
Yeah.
said that. And I think the other thing I'll just say, it's also interesting that she spent her life working in a community college, which takes a real level of dedication. And I think that, I think that Hillary Clinton is one example, but I think that first ladies can have very substantive agendas in ways that are procedurally sound. I think part of the problem with the Clintons is the lines between them were sometimes blurred in terms of procedures and process, which opened them up to sometimes fair or unfair attacks. But I think that she can carve out her own space and her own identity. And I think, there's a way in which the United States, professors don't command the respect that they do in other countries. And I think simply modeling, to people what higher education is, it's like another version of what Kamala Harris will have to do in terms of representation. But I hope that she does have some kind of portfolio on higher education.
Thank you. I mean, that's great. I mean, I think that, just playing that role of elevating the value of all educators, right? Primary school educator, initial caregivers, all the way to professors, where this notion that, we work 9 months and then we don't do anything else.
Yeah.
And has to change. And I think she could play an important role in that. There's a question by Anushka Srinivas, and she wants to kind of carry a little bit further the conversation we've had on advice to students to continue aspiring to taste the ground.
Yeah.
And not fall into the trap of narrow perspectives or the blind spots.
Yeah.
And please keep your questions coming.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if I remember, it was, so what do we do to allow that to happen? I think.
Yeah.
I think we just have to keep, in some ways, we have to just, there's so much media saturation and there's just so much messaging about what is valuable and what is not valuable. And I was thinking about your earlier comment, just to go back to something you said earlier about the growth of the self. And there's such a narrow definition of what counts as self-interest in the United States. Self-interest is career, it's money, it's success. Not, and I think part of what you're saying about having a purpose is broadening the definition of how we think of ourselves. And so that's one side. So one side of the coin is sort of, what are we telling students they need to live a better life? What counts as a better life? And then the other side of it is that we are never going to live better lives if we don't understand that everything we do is connected to other people in the world. That everything in the United States, particularly everything we consume in terms of policy decisions. A lot of times when people when I've been asked, when I've pushed back, for example, about some kinds of U.S. intervention, I've heard people say, "But we want to do something," and I would say, "Well, think also about how U.S. policy affects other countries. You don't always have to travel." So there are many ways to fill those blind spots. And then, in terms of the tasting the ground, it's just finding ways for students to understand how life-changing it can be to step outside of yourself, and to stop seeing the world just through your narrow lens and that it goes back to this idea of growth, that you actually change as a person when you start seeing things through other lenses. I'll just give you one personal example. I go to India very frequently because I do field work there, and I do field work which is extensive, so I have to go for long periods of time. And even to this day, when I go initially, I have to learn, of course, now with COVID, it's different, but I would normally have to unlearn these spatial boundaries where people close doors and keep distances. And of course, it's ironic now in the context of COVID, but it's almost like a physical unlearning of like social distance. And and I always feel like my alienation goes away immediately as soon as I land in India because of the way in which my body was programmed growing up. And so there are things which are even not verbal, which students will never understand if we don't give them ways of thinking of themselves differently without this lens of self-interest, this narrow lens of self-interest. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it is, no, I think in some ways, what you're really talking about is experiential learning. And how do we get people to get out of their discomfort of experiential learning?
Yeah.
And most people who travel into India, I mean, the first thing, they just look at this mass of humanity that is so close to each other.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't, I mean, people come and stand right next to you to talk to you.
Yes. Yeah.
And you keep moving further away, but there is no place to move back because there is somebody else there.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So how do you start getting comfortable in that? So this notion of experiential learning, I think, is just very important. I think I'm so glad that you've touched upon it. And, just getting people to, one of the things that, I do a lot of work around homelessness issues. And intellectually, I know, right? And experientially, I know that when you pass a homeless person, look them in the eye and just smile if you want to, but don't ignore them.
Yeah.
And yet, so many times you do the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Because you feel they're going to ask you for something and you don't want to give something.
Yeah.
But that give might just be a smile.
Yeah.
And an acknowledgement that they exist. And I think that is what I want our students to learn when we actually talk about tasting the ground.
Yes.
Is acknowledge the other person as a human in their own reality, not in your own.
Yeah.
And if we can do that, then I think we can really make a difference. There is a question which I do want you to answer, and then we're going to run out of time, is Rao Varanasi's question to you successfully transition from a STEM field to a non-STEM field. As far as I know, you're the only one to achieve the successful transition. Please tell us how you did it.
So I'm actually not the only one because I've met many people who I've shared, I've had this sharing with. We just keep it hidden, many of us. So here's the thing. It's about the issue of success. I didn't transition because I was looking for success. I transitioned because it's a little bit what you were saying about this search for purpose. I was just so I went into STEM because I love math. You would never know this from my scholarship because I don't do quantitative work, but I was very, very good at mathematics and I loved mathematics. And to this day, I still miss it to some extent, but I made the mistake of going into engineering, which was much more, and no offense to anyone who's an engineer who's looking, this is just me, but I didn't, it was a very professionalized, it was a very different kind of atmosphere. I also, if I'm being a little bit political, I would say this was, and I'm dating myself, this was in the 80s when engineering became much more tied with it was a time when SDI, what was used to be called the Star Wars project of the Reagan administration was expanding. And so there was a lot of internal changes within the profession of engineering. And I actually, what I did, the practical thing I did was I double majored in computer engineering and English literature. So I finished the engineering, but I added a major. And the English literature was really what made me. It just was basically like breath for me. It was like air, which I could breathe. And, we talk a lot about multiculturalism, and that was a very conservative time. So these were all the canonical Europeanist texts. This is before the post-colonial turn in English. And I loved everything I wrote. And that really made me, it made me who I am. And then, of course, I went into the social sciences because my background was, I was interested in politics, and I was always interested in inequality. But I had no idea that I was not, when I was making decisions, I wasn't thinking about success. I was just thinking about like what would appeal to me, what would make me feel more alive, because I would feel so deadened in my computer engineering classes. And I was also rebelling because it was at that point it was before all the diversity stuff, so it was very white, really male, and I just didn't want to do it. And so I think just thinking about what makes you happy, what makes you feel alive, and also being a little bit stubborn, and allowing yourself to fail. We talk so much about success and comfort in current pedagogical approaches in liberal arts education. What we need really is failure and discomfort to really allow ourselves to find purpose. Maybe that's what I'll say. I'm not sure if that's a practical answer, but that's.
No, I think it's just a fantastic answer, right? I mean, I think that, for students and for all of us, again, I mean, I think that, in my parlance, I mean, you discovered your purpose.
Yeah.
And you were able to marry so many different aspects of your training into the work that you're doing now. I mean, engineering, and I'm an engineer, I'm an architect, so I kind of came from a very different discipline. But it gives you a certain structure in which you think.
Yeah.
And then when you're overlaying it with issues of deep cultural empathy, you then can get this unique opportunity to be who you are as an individual. And once you get into a point where you can actually really utilize who you are to thrive, then I think you can be successful. I want to just end by, we have a couple of minutes, but just any last thoughts you would have to our listeners as to how they should work within the current reality and the hope that is out there.
So, I would say that the times we're in are scary, I think, because there's so much uncertainty. And for those of us in the United States, I think the COVID plus the uncertainty of the election, even though the results are clear, it's still a scary time. I think so many of you are international, I can see from the chat. So many nations are going through turmoil. So many formal democracies are not functioning as democracies. So many countries are, anti-democratic or authoritarian. And so much inequality is just so prevalent. It's very scary. But times of deep crisis can be times of deep transformation, and you have to just. You have to understand you won't, picking up on what you said, you won't know I never knew the answer, what I was going to do in advance. I just knew like a vague goal that I had. And so I would just say, try to turn the crisis and the uncertainty into something that transforms yourself and people around you is all I would say.
Leela, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This has been a rich and enriching conversation for the Office of Global Affairs to pull this together, to the Jackson School for International Studies for allowing us to have this conversation with Dr. Fernandes. And it was such a pleasure talking with you, and I hope that we can find other ways to continue this conversation. All of you have a great evening. And for those of you that have joined from around the world, whatever time zone you are in, wishing you the very best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.